Straighten my collar and we're good. Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the last class of Who is a Person and When Does It Matter? Rabbi Jonathan is away, so I will be flying solo tonight. And of all the topics for me to do that on, this is the one I'm most passionate about, I got to say. I feel like I have some of the most to say, and my feelings are some of the strongest. So this is a good spot to be in. We're going to talk about abortion tonight. Perhaps a sudden swerve towards the serious following on the heels of Purim, which was a blast. Thank you all for coming the other night. But it's a really good one to kind of take some of the ideas that we've talked about with regard to personhood as a philosophical idea, as a Jewish idea, to kind of take them for a walk and see how they play out in a real scenario. The question of personhood is crucial to debate around abortion. I mean, in Jewish thinking, and I mean, I think in the discourse in America as well. A common anti-abortion talking point, of course, you probably heard that life begins at conception. Yes. I think the implication being like personhood begins at conception. Like that's a full-fledged life, and terminating it without is morally unacceptable. And that may or may not be true from a technical scientific standpoint. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but that's from a Jewish standpoint not actually the relevant issue. There's no blanket prohibition on harming life per se, as in, a thing that is alive, that comes to us through Torah or Jewish tradition. We, recall, we're permitted to eat plants and eat animals and take away their life for our own ends and our purposes. So just life itself is not, there's no prohibition on destroying it. There's, sense that it needs to be used responsibly if we are going to take advantage for our own benefit. But just there's no blanket prohibition on destruction of life. We're talking from a Jewish perspective when we talk about permissibility or forbiddenness of abortion. We're talking about precisely what kinds of moral considerations are due to that life, or that that potential life. We'll go into some of those cases, and also to the other lives that are involved. I think there's a lot of temptation to focus on the life of the unborn child, and less so on the life of the mother. And from a Jewish perspective, both are important to consider, because we have to and especially circle back to that note we sort of made, that kind of content warning right at the beginning of the first class, that ideas about who is a person, who is a person, who isn't, have historically been used as tools for creating human exceptionalism, supremacy both over nature and white supremacy over non-white humans. This Torah of personhood, as I'm starting to call it, is extremely potent and potentially dangerous. And the reason Rabbi Jonathan and I chose to teach on it is because we think it actually has the possibility to do tremendous good if it's applied properly and in line with our intuitions about the moral value of various beings. So this is one of those places where I feel the Torah of personhood can do real good, because we understand intuitively that human life is valuable. I mean, we learn that from our Jewish sources, but I think even if we didn't have those, even if we just, were deriving these kind of things from nature, we would derive a certain sense of value to humanity. But rather than allow that kind of unreasoned, intuitive response to be the end of the conversation, by applying halachic and philosophical concepts of personhood to the question of abortion, when it should be permitted, when it should be forbidden, we allow our response to be shaped by the values that underlie halakha. Things like tselem Elohim, creation in the divine image. Things like kavod habriot, the essential dignity that's owed to every human being and every divine creation, towards a protocol for when this is forbidden or permitted, that takes seriously our moral considerations towards both the unborn life and also the life of the mother, weighing them carefully, enabling us to chart a path forward towards a positive, life-affirming medical intervention where needed. So I think this is a really positive way to frame a discussion about abortion, by contemplating and examining the personhood of the parties involved. And I think it's one that if it was embraced by the broader discourse in America could lead us out of what has more or less become an intractable problem where two sides are talking straight past each other. Okay. So let's review just a little bit. How have we thus far come to understand the kind of moral considerations due to persons? Well, we know for a baseline, they can't be killed for no reason. I mean, I think that's pretty much, we looked at a text last week, one who sheds the blood of man, by man should his blood be shed. Murder is prohibited. I mean, we didn't look at the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments in specific, but I'm taking for granted that you're familiar with, murdering people is bad. It seems okay. So human life can't be taken for no reason. We did start to talk last week when we talked about capital punishment about specific valid reasons that human life could be taken. Case in point, violating mitzvot for which the penalty is death. I'm curious. I mean, if we had an infinite number of classes, we could go more and more of these. Help me brainstorm some potential more examples here. What other valid reasons can you think of to take potentially valid reasons could you think of to take a life besides capital punishment?
To protect your own life, self-defense.
Good, self-defense. Yeah, that's a pretty obvious one. Can you think of any others?
Well, to protect someone else's life.
Good. Okay. Protect your life or someone else's. Sure. Good. Any other ideas? I thought of only one more, to be honest.
In the military context, the war.
That was mine too. An enemy combatant. Yes, it's potentially yes. Good. There may be that was the end of my brainstorm. I couldn't think of any more. But in order to, so it's worth actually touching on an enemy combatant. Because it takes place in the theater of battle. That's kind of a different scenario. We're going to put that one aside, but we are going to talk about self-defense and preservation of life when there is a pursuer, as it's called, a rodef, someone pursuing you. In order to there's kind of two underlying concepts I need to introduce before we can get into the sort of debate proper about abortion. So let's take a look at the first source on our source sheets. And if you were watching along at home, you can find the link in the show notes there to a Sefaria source sheet. So this is from Maimonides, the Rambam, his Mishnah Torah, and the section on the murderer and the preservation of life, pikuach nefesh in Hebrew. And we're going to introduce the concept of a rodef, a pursuer, and when it's all right to kill them. Adam, would you mind reading for us?
Number one.
Yeah. So he has. This is from the first chapter, and I've kind of selected from about the nine individual halachot, the 9 individual laws here. Number one is sort of, you got to start with number one, but it's just in it. Go ahead.
Whenever a person kills a human being, he transgresses a negative commandment. As it says, do not murder. Okay, we got that. So someone who, but it's important for him to set up his argument. If you're by murdering, you're going to transgress a commandment. Good, keep going. So jumping ahead to number 5. Yeah. When a murderer kills willfully, he should not be killed by witnesses or observers until he is brought to court and sentenced to death. Okay,
and he goes on to basically reiterate that same thing. So I saved some time there, meaning basically we don't do vigilante justice, right? He shouldn't be killed by witnesses or observers until he's brought to court and sentenced to death. This is a related topic about the necessity for courts and a fair trial and things like that. You can see that value already encoded here. Go ahead, keep going.
When does the above apply? When the person has already transgressed and performed the transgression for which he is liable to be executed by the court. When, however, a person is pursuing a colleague with the intention of killing him, even if the pursuer is a minor, every Jewish person is commanded to attempt to save the person being pursued, even if it is necessary to kill the pursuer.
Okay, so wow, what made you say wow, Susan? Good. I think this is a little bit.
It's okay to kill somebody, before he actually does anything wrong, actually.
Right.
It's premeditated.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is pretty radical relative to what we'd seen above, that, they have to be brought before a court.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Good. What else in there might be a wow moment. I think there's a couple other things that are potentially.
Even if the pursuer is a minor.
Okay, good.
Wow.
Okay, so let's touch back just for a second on our questions about autonomy and heteronomy. We were talking about how it's essential in order for a person to be subject to the law and therefore subject to the punishments, for them to be autonomous and make their own decisions. There's always that kind of gray area with minors, right? Are they really in control? Are they really responsible? And in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And it's always, a bit of a gray area. And here, perhaps surprisingly, even if the pursuer is a minor, we're allowed to kill a minor before they go through with an attempted murder. Yes.
So this is a child under 13? Is that how a minor would be defined at this point?
Probably. My guess, I didn't pull up the Hebrew. My guess is he probably uses the word katan, like a child, which is not necessarily defined in a technical sense. But yeah, probably under 13 would be the.
Wow.
Yeah. Although I don't know, I'm sure there are other commentators who've thought about that, or who know more about how Rambam specifically deploys that term. So I can't say that for certain. Yes. Good. But I mean, if it's a minor, it's, all the way down to, the littlest kids too. So.
Wow.
Although hopefully, presumably, if it's that little kid, you might be able to stop him short of having to kill him.
Right.
As an adult.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does say, save the person, even if it is necessary to kill. It doesn't
Good.
say, just shoot him out of hand.
Good.
It says,
Yeah.
Just try to save that person he's
Mhm.
pursuing.
Right. Which, in theory could be done with much less than lethal means all the time. Right. Of course. Good. So actually that's precisely where Rambam goes. Adam, why don't you keep reading number 7 there?
What is implied? If the Rodef pursuer was warned and continues to pursue his intended victim, even though he did not acknowledge the warning, since he continues his pursuit, he should be killed. If it is possible to save the pursued by damaging one of the limbs of the Rodef, one should. Thus, if one can strike him with an arrow, a stone, or a sword, and cut off his hand, break his leg, blind him, or in any other way prevent him from achieving his objective, one should do so. If there is no way to be precise in one's aim and save the person being pursued without killing the Rodef, one should kill him, even though he has not yet killed his victim.
All right. So that's exactly where it goes, is what does non-lethal force look like? And in Rambam's world of medieval world, that's an arrow, a stone, or a sword, potentially cutting off a limb, doing real damage to the person, but stopping short of killing, right? Even though they haven't yet killed. Okay. So what are some of the implications here of our obligation? And I should note too, it's not just you should try or you can kill. It's every Jewish person is commanded to attempt to save the person being pursued, even if it's necessary to kill, right? It's actually a positive thing. Like, you are obligated to if not get in the way yourself, at least do your very best to stop this act, right? So what?
Stand idly by your brother.
It's very good. That was the theme of at Beit Midrash this past Sunday, as a matter of fact. That was the learning theme. Was Lo Talmud. Yes, very good. So, what are some of the implications of our obligation to kill the Rodef? So, when we're in a scenario where someone will potentially or probably die, there is some preference as to who that someone ought to be. Like, when someone is pursuing with an intent to kill, and there's a lot to unpack still about how do you determine intent. It's sort of taken for granted. He has the intent to kill. There's also this piece about warning. They go into, I think we've talked about the reluctance to carry out death penalties, which means, like, in order for this person to be tried and convicted and sentenced to death, they have to have been warned first. The first thing you might have to do is shout, "Don't kill that person. That's a sin," right? So that setting that aside, we're in a scenario where one of these two people is going to die. Either we're going to let them carry out their crime and kill a person, or we're going to have to potentially kill them. There is a preference. Like, we have a preference of who lives and who dies. And if someone has to die, we'd rather it be the person trying to sin, right? The pursuer. Okay, that sounds a little bit pedantic, but it'll be important later. It's an example of a permitted killing outside of a punishment framework. I mean, pretty obviously, because no crime has been committed. Yes, right. But it's nonetheless an example of a time that it is permissible to kill somebody outside of crime and punishment. And like I said, in fact, the killing is not even just permitted; it's in fact mandated. The rodef has to be stopped, even at the cost of their life. And there's an important value you may have heard of before, pikuach nefesh, the value of saving a life. It comes up in a lot of other contexts about sort of exploring the limits of Shabbat and Shabbat observance. When are you allowed to break the laws of Shabbat? If a life is ever at stake, you put everything else aside, and it ends up making its way to the top of the hierarchy. You're allowed to do basically everything to save a life.
Almost everything.
Yes, almost everything, exactly. But it's still, as values go, way up there. Good. Okay, so those are some important implications of the halakha of the rodef, the pursuer. Any questions about that so far? Yeah.
What's the reason the rabbis or the law or the halakha would give for valuing the life of the pursued over the pursuer? And I'm thinking here not of, Ted Bundy, but
Sure.
maybe a minor child who's mentally, or someone, or even an adult who's mentally
Mhm.
delusional.
Right.
So there has to be some reason why they are putting on life. Is it because it's innocent? But
Mhm.
if someone's mentally ill, maybe they could be considered innocent too, or
Mhm.
minor. So I'm wondering what their underlying
Yeah.
rationales are.
I mean, it does sound on one hand counterintuitive or against what we might think, because there's a lot of other evidence that everyone's life is treated equally. Like, when we die and we're buried, we all wear the same white shroud, right? The same simple casket, right? Same burial in the ground, no matter if you're a king or a slave, right? And here there's a preference about who lives or who does. So it is perhaps confounding. I have my guess. Do you have any ideas? Because I'm not sure there's a clear answer. My best guess is that if we allowing the murder to go through sort of just increases violence and increases sin. And I would say in Rambam's era, I mean, he's obviously drawing on halakhic sources and really this is his law code. He's pulling all these other things together. The idea of retributive justice and sort of sin in Israel drives away the divine presence. Here we can get away without a sin ever happening. The result ends up being the same, but no one committed a crime to get there. You know what I mean? Like only one killing act, and it's a sanctioned one, as opposed to a non-sanctioned one. That's my best guess. I'm sure there's more commentary written about this particular passage that would go there. What's important for us is the sort of bottom line that there can sometimes be a preference.
I'd point out in modern law, Oregon law says you can kill somebody in defense of another person.
Oh, yeah,
in
I'm not
the jail,
arguing,
so-
I'm not arguing
Yeah.
morality. I was
Right.
more curious about what
Right.
the rabbis had to say about, this is why our preference goes this way instead of that way.
Right.
So in Oregon law, what you said, Mike, so if somebody is being attacked and you kill them to protect them, that's considered,
You killed the attacker.
yeah, kill the
If the
attacker.
attacker is about to use
Deadly force.
deadly force,
Yeah,
then you can use deadly force to kill the attacker.
and you're not held liable for that.
It's a defense to murder.
Okay.
But the jury makes the call. Was it self-defense or defense of others or not?
Okay, so
But-
defense of others besides self-defense is,
Yes.
okay,
So this matches, not the maiming before you kill part of it.
yeah.
Not the minors part of it, but just as a general legal proposition. Killing another
The
person,
maiming is, shoot for the knee or the leg
Right,
instead
yeah.
of for the
and of course, they don't teach you that with
Right.
firearms.
Right.
No, because it's.
That actually
you're
crossed
not
my
very
mind too. It's
practical.
like, yes, with when training to shoot firearms, they teach you to aim for the center of mass so that you don't.
Well, it's
so you don't
impractical
miss.
to think that you're gonna hit the arm with the leg.
Right. Where here it's sort of saying like you're supposed to shoot for the leg or whatever. But I mean, this is obviously
Well, it does say there's
pre-firearm
no way to be
era.
precise. It says if it's possible.
Right,
and it gives
right,
you an
right,
out,
right,
You can't be precise
Mhm.
in your aim,
Right.
which most of us probably.
Right. Good. Okay. So before getting into the potential personhood and permissibility of terminating a fetus, there's one more important framework to go into. And that's from source number 2. Rachel, you're up. Would you mind reading source number 2 there from Leviticus?
If anyone maims this fellow, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it, but one who kills a human being shall be put to death.
Okay, so ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye. Heard of this before, I assume, yes? Just, your immediate reaction to it. Does it generally have a positive reputation, an eye for an eye? Yeah, so what's the rest of the proverb? An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Right? Okay.
But I thought it was originally written so that you didn't punish somebody for something, that it was the punishment was equivalent.
Good. So yes, very good. In fact, this is one of the pieces that appears to be, if not lifted completely, but at least inspired by other ancient Near Eastern texts, particularly the Hammurabi's Code. He probably gets credit for the eye for an eye thing. In ancient Babylon, it may very well have meant a literal eye for a literal eye, which is, by our standards, barbaric, but in other ways, a significant advance legally to say that you gotta make it equal. You don't get to just, you poke me, I get to kill you. Like that doesn't square. Now the rabbis, it's important to note, understood this law to mean money. Right. They were the rabbis already by the rabbinic era. They were not interested in like literal tit for tat punishments.
Yeah.
If you put out my eye, you owe me the value of an eye. So they understood all of this in terms of value. Really? Right. They were not. I mean, that's the rabbis. They're not. I mean, you've seen their reluctance for all sorts of killing and things. I mean, they had already internalized the an eye for an eye makes the world blind bit and realized that it didn't make any real sense. So yes, they understood this in terms of the value of an eye, and not just applying to physical, bodily harm, but if you break something, break some of my property, you can replace the thing, but what you really owe me is the value of the damage that you did, right? It's the basis of tort law, as far as I understand it. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a lot of friends who are lawyers. Okay, so payment for damages for injury, and it notes here, as we already noted, that a murder is a capital offense. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it. In other words, beasts are property. That's something you just pay back. But one who kills a human being, I think in one way you could say we leave the eye for an eye framework. And another way you say it's very much in the eye for an eye framework. There's no paying back for a capital crime. There's no restitution money. That's a capital crime. Okay. So what's important and the reason to go to this basic, this sort of central foundational principle of halakha is, it's the principle for proportionality and dispensing justice. The punishment has to fit the crime. The restitution has to fit the damages. That's going to be immediately relevant in text number 3. We're going to start to get to a biblical text that lays the groundwork for understanding the personhood of the fetus or lack thereof. So Susan, you're up. Could you read for us from Exodus chapter 21, source number 3?
Sure. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Right. Okay. Can anyone explain in their own words what's going on here? Because the language can be a little bit dense. Do you think you understand it?
It sounds like the fetus is considered more property.
Good. What makes you say that?
Because the husband gets paid for
Mm-hmm.
the damage that was done by the miscarriage, by losing the fetus.
Good.
Yeah.
So Susan, excellent, Susan. You were not misled, because I just said that eye for an eye is understood to be about money and about property and torts and things like that. And here we have basically an eye for an eye. But you were not misled by that. You read the first line very carefully. When two people fight, one of them pushes a pregnant woman in miscarriage, but no other damage. And I highlighted that there. The word is ason. It's sort of a vague term. It's translated, I think, here accurately as other damage. Damage in the sense of creating a tort. No other damage ensues. The one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. And the understanding is that's a court figures out the value, basically. Notable, the patriarchy involved here, the fetus is whose property? The man's, right? Okay, that's so notable and unfortunate, but you correctly noted that in the first, in that first verse, the damage is to property. There's no eye for an eye restitution. It's a evaluation of what is a fetus worth. Potentially, I guess the husband has some role. I think this would probably act. He would go before a court and claim how much it is. Something like that. It's not totally clear from this. So a lot of people read this, and I've seen this text used as an anti-abortion text. Because people go and read it, they read the word aso and the other damage as referring to the death of the fetus, and so they say if other damage ensues, the penalty should be life for life. So they read it to try to say the fetus dies, there needs to be a death, an eye for an eye kind of thing, right? Which is clearly not what this says. Which I'm really glad you saw right to that point. It's the injury to the. What do you think other damage? What do you think ason would be then if it's not the death of the fetus?
Well, to the mother.
Good. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Because that's the husband's property as well.
Yes. It doesn't say who it goes to, and here the rabbinic understanding is an eye for eye means money. It's not clear that the Bible understands that. It may very well be if, the woman being pushed loses a tooth or something like that, we're going to go knock out his tooth. But we've entered another framework here. We're talking about bodily injury to the woman, right? That's the other damage above and beyond just property, right? Because I think an eye for an eye becomes applied to property law, but in the biblical understanding, it was like specifically for personal injury. Okay.
No, there's one more point in here.
Yeah.
Before, the other damage or life for life, eye for eye was based on intentional harm.
Good.
And this excerpt is basically saying negligent harm.
Indeed.
So if and it implies based on other damage, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and she falls and dies,
Right.
Then he may be
right.
even though it was an accident.
Right. It's not premeditated murder at
I
all.
don't get this as an accident. When one pushes, it seems like there's intentionality.
Well,
Yes,
it's
well,
more that
It
Mike
could
just
be
said.
just kind of pushing her aside so he can fight with her husband.
I see.
Right.
Or it
They're
could
fighting
be-
and they bump bang into her.
Yeah.
It's
But
definitely not clear from here. Yeah.
It's not premeditated, it doesn't sound
Mhm.
premeditated.
It doesn't sound, yeah. it doesn't
But I have
sound-
a question. It says when men fight,
Mhm.
and I think that phrase occurs a couple other times when men fight. Because there's another one when men fight and then the woman intervenes and she unfairly,
Right. Grabs him by the.
right.
Yes, that is nearby here. What's your question?
So are we to interpret that as two men are fighting? Or could it be interpreted as when men fight with a woman and they push her?
Oh.
Oh,
what I'm
that's
trying to-
interesting.
So I don't know. In the second case, when the woman grabs something, it's obvious. Well, maybe it's not obvious.
That's a really good question. I've always read this as two men fighting each
Yeah.
other and injury to the woman as being negligent incidental damage. I wonder if someone has read it your way. I don't know. and we'd have to go look.
Interesting.
Yeah,
And I don't know, there's one more thing.
Well, this is
Yeah, please.
all men.
yeah. It's definitely it's definitely two men. It's definitely more than one man. But Yinatsu is just-
One woman.
It's just they fight, and I don't think it's clear.
If the woman loses the child,
Right.
it's saying the implication is there's no exact determination of value for that lost
Well, it's
child.
right.
It's to be determined by the husband.
It's like a negotiation, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's the point? It's unlike an eye or a tooth,
Right,
which, there's
right.
an equivalent
Mm-hmm.
here.
Right. It's outside that framework.
It has to be determined what that
Right.
life was worth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the point of an eye for an eye. Is there's essentially an absolute value of an eye,
Right.
and that's what you're matching. Here, it's saying, we take into account, like, how much do I care about this fetus, for example, right? Like all that kind of stuff.
Would they take into account whether it was a male or female?
Potentially, yeah, potentially, yeah.
If they were an elderly couple and like this was their last chance to
Yeah.
have a child, they didn't have any other kids. I mean, there's all kinds
Sure,
of-
right. That could sway,
Seems like
right?
it leaves room for that, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
That's part of the calculus, that's part of the.
Right. It leaves room for all that in a way that an eye
Right.
for an eye doesn't, right? Very good point. Very good point. And very good, Mike, to note that we're not talking about, this is in sort of an undergirding text for talking about abortion, but this is not intentional termination. This is, negligent, accidental, probably termination of the fetus. They push the woman, clearly not intending to do that. But notable, injury of fetus,
Yeah.
even such that it dies, doesn't count as injury to the person. Like that, you might have thought that the fetus would be part of the woman's, would be the woman, intentionally exactly the same thing. And an injury to the fetus would be an injury to her. And that's not the case. It's not considered bodily harm to the woman, right? That it falls outside the rubric of an eye for an eye. And it certainly doesn't rise to the level of murder. Okay, good. Okay, let's keep going. I got some more foundational text here to talk about. We're moving ahead from the biblical period to the early 3rd century CE and the Mishnah. And Phyllis, I think you're up. Do you want to read Mishnah Olot? Source number 4 there for us.
If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another.
Okay, so this actually touches back on what you brought up, Rachel, about setting aside one life for, having any sort of preference, right? It says explicitly here, you may not set aside one, and I highlighted I bolded the words to show the specific one nefesh for another nefesh. You can't always be totally sure that every text is, because there's many different authors and they're not necessarily all using this as a technical term, but as we noted, that is one of the terms that people use to mean a person, right? A nefesh, like a human, a soul, right? So as a general principle, no, you can't do that. The Rodaf would be one example, and here's another. Okay, so there's 2 different clauses here. Let's examine the first one first. So if a woman is maksha leled, struggling to give birth, having trouble, having difficulty giving birth, not precisely clear. Again, these were not doctors. We don't know exactly what that means, but there seems to be some trouble giving birth. And note, it's not at all clear here either. Is the woman's life in danger or not? Presumably it is. I mean, any sort of birthing difficulty in the ancient world would have been a real cause for concern, but it's not made an explicit precondition for intervention here. It just says difficulty, right? So that's notable. If she's having difficulty giving birth, I mean, it is a bit graphic here. An abortion is performed, right? It says they cut it up and bring it out one piece at a time to make it easy on her. Why? And it says there in that, I guess, first clause, second half, because her life becomes before the life of the child. That literally code means to proceed, to come before, come at both temporally, both in terms of importance. It literally comes first. her life comes before the life of the child. And notably here, again, we can't be sure they're using technical terms, but they don't say nefesh about the child. They say chaya. It's life, it's livingness, right? Or chayeha, shechayeha kodmin l'chayav. Like her life comes before its life. Different from the word nefesh. I think we can't be sure these are technical terms, but I think we can be sure they are deliberately not applying the term nefesh to the fetus, right?
Yeah.
They might have said her nefesh comes before its chayav, but then you lose the nice parallelism. So, okay. Anyway, and remember, this was an oral text. They had to remember this. It was probably easy to remember that way. Okay. So we have there already, yet another example of preference for one life over another. The mother's life comes before the life of the child, notably while it's still inside. Because if you get to the second clause, if the greater part, the rove, the majority of it, which readers of this understood to mean the head, like the majority, the majority of it, meaning most of its head, is out, no abortion can be performed. You are not to touch it. Why? Because one nefesh is not any more important than nefesh. So when does the transition happen? When it's significantly outside the womb, right?
So you're pretty sure that referred to the head. I was thinking about a breech birth, for instance, where most of the body is out.
Right. It's not at all clear. It just says most of it.
Yeah.
Which the way this has always been understood by readers and the way it gets understood in the Hoffa literature is the majority of the head.
Oh,
And that most births are head first, and I guess like once it's
greater part is.
so it's actually not the majority of the whole mass of the baby,
Yeah.
just the majority of the head, which is, from my limited experience and observational experience, one of the harder parts.
Yes.
It's the hardest part, in fact, right? Good. So you can see, like, if she's made it that far, like this is not totally, totally arbitrary. If she's made it past halfway, if that is really the hardest part of giving birth,
then probably she'll be okay to go to the rest.
right, it's going to get easier from here as opposed to more difficult. Whereas, if she's struggling and nothing's, not even out at all, we know it's going to get worse before it gets better.
And with the breech, isn't that potentially more dangerous?
Mhm.
I would have to imagine.
Much more.
I'm sure there are folks here who know those kind of answers, but I have to imagine a low percentage of breech bursts, ended in viable babies. But I don't know, at least in that era. Okay. So we crossed an important threshold here. We're starting to pin down, when does this unborn life become worthy of moral consideration to the point that we can't touch it anymore, right? Up to this point, it's been, essentially property. Certainly not rising the level of moral consideration of a person. Notably, the mother, on the other hand, considering her personhood as well, is clearly a person requiring moral consideration. Her life needs to be saved if we can save it, basically. Up to the point where it would be, a choice that we're not allowed to make. Already, I think it's really notable. We have a rabbinic warrant for medical intervention in cases of complications arising during labor, even where that would mean aborting the fetus. So I think already Jewish tradition is miles ahead of some other religious traditions who just never even get this far. Catholics, for example. Already there is at least a scenario where this could be possible, and in fact mandatory. Okay.
I thought in Catholicism that abortion was allowed to save the life of the mother. Am I wrong?
I'm only an expert on one religion. They may be a mischaracterization.
That both lives are of equal value in Catholicism.
Okay, then maybe there may be more conservative Christians than that. There are definitely folks who are like, no abortions under any circumstances. Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Well,
My apologies to any Catholic viewers.
well, I'll tell you an anecdote. Way back to my sister, the one child she was having with her husband, and there was an option to go to a Catholic hospital, and I remember him saying that he didn't want her to go because at that time, it was in the 60s or 70s, they might take the child before the mother's life.
Mhm.
He said, I didn't marry that child, I married that woman. I don't want to lose her. So they did not go to that Catholic hospital.
Hmm.
Now, I don't know if that answers anything about it, but at least that was his impression or understanding of a Catholic hospital. It could go either way.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Depending on your doctor.
it depends on
Right,
that,
right,
among
right,
other things, yes. Yes.
Good. Okay. Good. So we're making progress, and we're gonna wind the clock a little further forward, moving ahead from the Mishnah to the Gemara, to the Talmud, and we're on to source number 5. It's the beginning of that second page at the bottom, Yevamot 69b. And Mike, is it your turn?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead and read it from the Talmud. And I'm sorry. Sorry to cut you off. Just as you're starting, remember when you're reading the way this translation formats the Talmud. Here, the bolding is not my hand. That's the way. The bold is what's sort of literally translated from the Hebrew and Aramaic. All the other non-bolded words are added to make that make sense, and frequently to include some on-the-fly commentary as well. So only the bold is what's actually there. Okay, go ahead.
In the case of the daughter of a priest who married an Israelite and her husband died on that same day, she immerses to purify herself, as she is ritually impure due to their intercourse, and she may not partake of teruma that same evening.
Okay.
She may partake.
She may partake.
Okay.
What is teruma?
Okay, good. I'm going to pause you there because we already have a whole lot to explain. This one is complicated. Bear with me. Okay. So we're moving past, just a simple question of can you terminate a fetus or not, to a more nuanced consideration of personhood. And we're moving all the way back from, the moment just before, just before birth to the moment just after conception. When is, the question we're going to encounter is, when is a woman really considered pregnant in the first place? Okay. So the case under consideration, the case of the daughter of a priest. So priests have a special status, so we call them Kohanim. You might know someone by the name Cohen, who identifies as a descendant of the Kohanim, have a special status. There are certain rules associated with who they can and cannot marry. They can't marry a divorcee. They can't marry a convert, things like that. They're allowed to marry an Israelite. Both the daughter of a Kohen can marry an Israelite and a Kohen can marry but the status thing gets a little confusing. Okay. Ordinarily, daughters of priests are entitled to eat what's called truma. So truma, there was an agricultural tithe that was collected. Remember, the priests didn't work. They worked in the temple, so they didn't have their own land to farm. So they were sustained by the community through the process of tithing. You would bring in your harvest. You would set aside a certain amount that you would bring to the temple, and that would go to feed the priesthood. There were a lot of restrictions put on the truma itself because it was such a, it was kind of semi-holy food because it was for maintenance of the divine service. So there were a lot of restrictions on who could eat it. If you were found to have eaten truma, like for example, if you ate from your produce before tithing it, it's possible you ate the part that was truma. That's a questionable violation. You need to tithe first before you can eat anything. So you're certain you're not eating from that little truma pile. You're only eating from the part that's actually yours. So they put a lot of thought into this about who can eat it, who can't. Okay. Normally, the daughter of a priest is she's not a priest herself. She's a bat kohen, but she's of a priestly family and therefore allowed to eat from truma, that agricultural tithe. A non-priest eating truma would be considered basically them stealing from the priesthood. Okay. When a couple gets married, the wife takes on her husband's status. So in this case, the bat kohen would essentially cease being, even so she's the higher status, she takes on his status. So she stops being a priest and becomes a regular Israelite like him. Important note, a crucial part of marriage in Jewish tradition is the consummation of marriage. That you're not really married until you've consummated the marriage, basically. That is the completion of the process. So it was legally significant, basically. You haven't fully completed the process until consummated. Okay. So she marries him, and we're supposed to understand that they went ahead and consummated the marriage on the day of the wedding as your traditional, and he dies on that same day. Okay. Okay. Oh, right. He dies on the same day just after consummating marriage. When a husband dies, there's a whole other body of Jewish law that you need to know to understand this. The widow collects her ketubah, not like those beautiful documents outside, which today ketubah means the contract itself. In the Talmudic era, the ketubah was either a sum of money or an object of value that would be basically set aside and designated for the wife should the marriage dissolve through divorce or through the husband's death. It would be set aside so that the husband's estate would pass to his heirs, and the widower or divorcee would have something to sustain herself on, at least temporarily. Okay. So normally what would happen, she would collect her ketubah and then return to her father's house. Now her father's house is the temple precincts because he is a priest, which means going back on his support system means going back to eating his truma, right? Okay. Hang on. If she's pregnant by her new husband, she's officially married to him, and therefore she's forsworn her Bat Kohen status and should no longer be permitted to eat that truma. Right? You're laughing, but this is the best part of Talmud. Okay. Are you following them?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. But she's allowed to do so anyway. You read that far, right? She immerses to purify herself. She's ritually impure to their intercourse. We got that. She may partake of truma that same evening. She can go home right away and eat. That should strike you as strange. We said she
purifies herself.
Yeah, that's because sex makes you icky. Right. And you need to. Okay. Ritually icky. Sorry. Right. So that and she would need to do that anyway for truma eating. But yes. Okay. So this seems like what gives here. Why is she allowed to go eat truma right away? Go ahead and keep reading. I think.
So evidently,
yes,
the sages were not concerned that she became pregnant from the initial act of intercourse, even that of marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Rav Chisda said she immerses and partakes of teruma only until 40 days after her husband's death, when there is still no reason for concern, as if she is not pregnant. If she's not pregnant, then she's not pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And if she is pregnant, until 40 days from the conception of the fetus is merely water.
Mm-hmm. And hear the explanation.
It is not yet considered a living being and therefore does not disqualify its mother from partaking of teruma.
Okay.
Oh.
So Chisda comes along and explains that this arrangement lasts for 40 days, or she's allowed to basically provisionally go ahead and eat truma, because otherwise, if she didn't, she'd have nothing to eat. She might have the the ketubah, but she's supposed to go back to her father's house. She'd have no support system, so that arrangement lasts for 40 days. At that point, he thinks it'll be obvious: either she's pregnant, in which case, or either she's not pregnant, in which case there's no problem. She has not, in fact, resigned her priesthood and can just stay eating truma, or we'll know that she is in fact pregnant, and then she needs to stop. Why is this the arrangement? If she was pregnant, if she's found to be pregnant, wasn't she stealing truma that whole time? Like, shouldn't she be, we're sort of allowing her to potentially be stealing this whole
Giving
time.
her the benefit of the doubt.
Okay, good.
Well, it's sort of like if she goes back to the priest and she's the priest's daughter,
Mm-hmm,
it's almost, and she can eat the truma,
mm-hmm.
so it's sort of like she becomes I don't know what the word is, but like the virgin bride, like she's able to.
Yeah. I mean, it's not.
I don't, that's not the right wordage, but
Yeah.
she's not looked at as a married woman.
Well, she's not because
she's
the
not
marriage is
married.
dissolved regardless, right?
But she's not looked at as the
But it's the
widow.
question is, has her status changed? Like the status change from Bat Kohen to Yisrael
Is
only
otherwise-
happens if the marriage is successfully consummate, like if she's pregnant.
Right.
Otherwise, it
Mrs.
doesn't.
Cocaine or
So it's not about the sex; it's about the
Mrs.
Right, so
Israel.
she's still a Kohen then,
if she's not pregnant.
if she's not pregnant.
Correct.
That's what I meant, like she reverts
I
back
think
to
so.
that
I'm going to say I think so.
original essence.
That is how I'm understanding this. Okay. So it lasts for 40 days, which is seems strange because wasn't she stealing Truma that whole time. If she turns out to be pregnant, and Chalista says, in fact, no, it's not a problem. We're not allowing her, because up to that 40 days, the fetus is merely water. Literally, it says, like, that's literally what it says. It's just water. In other words, it's not yet a living being. So even if she is pregnant and there's something growing there, she's not pregnant. She's pregnant, but she's not pregnant. If that makes sense. She's pregnant, but not with anything substantial.
The
anything
process has
consequential.
started, but hasn't turned into a life yet.
Correct. So,
Are we talking about literally pregnant or ritually pregnant?
Just a
I mean,
little-
that's kind of the question here, which is a hilarious way to phrase it in our understanding. But got to remember, from their perspective, they only had one pregnancy test, right? It was the eyeball test, right?
Right.
Like, when you start
The
showing or
eyeball
not.
test. Oh, the eyeball.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, these are all dudes. They're not like, they're not asking any women what they think or what they know here. These are all dudes. So for them, the pregnancy is real, and it's real when she starts to show. Okay. Right after this passage, this whole idea is in fact confirmed by Abaye, who comes in and confirms this, saying if she's pregnant, but she's not showing by 40 days, which in fact is pretty early. I think usually about 12 weeks is when they start showing, right?
It looks more like a missed period, isn't it? rather than-
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what 40 days
Yeah.
is, of course.
Right.
She's missed a period. So.
Okay, good point. You're right. That'll be right. Good point.
And they probably had more ways of knowing those kinds of things than we do
True.
these days.
They were certainly more in tune to it. Good point. Okay. Abaye comes and says if she's pregnant, but she's 40 days passes, and it doesn't seem like she's pregnant, and then later on we find out the truth. She only owes restitution for her stealing of Teruma back to 40 days. She doesn't owe it all the way back to to the date of the consummation, because remember that first 40 is gratis. Like the baby is not a baby; it's just water. So she only if it's say 49 days or whatever, she only owes 9 days of restitution. That makes sense? Okay. Furthermore, should be noted that halakhically, 40 days are counted from when the woman immersed in the mikvah. And a whole other thing here, not from the beginning of the last period, which is how doctors would usually count, how many weeks a woman is pregnant.
Oh.
So you would go immerse in the mikvah at the end of your period, and then you'd be basically, you would be impure for 14 days, for 2 weeks, then immerse, and then you're back in action, as it were. So it wouldn't count from the actual end of the period or the actual beginning of the period, from the immersion. So you can add 14 days, basically. So 40 halakhic days is more like 54 days by our measurement. If that makes sense. So that a little bit more of a fudge factor there. Okay, anyway. And 54 days, about 8 weeks, like I said, we'll start to know if she's missing periods. That's most of a first trimester. Like 12 weeks is about when she starts to show. So, there's in fact another opinion in the Talmud elsewhere where it says the fetus is recognized only after 3 months, as well, after the end of the first trimester as well. Okay. There are some, you learned a whole bunch of stuff about stuff to understand this. The part that's relevant to us, the implications for our discussion about abortion, life doesn't begin at conception, is, contrary to the common anecdotes from a Jewish legal standpoint. If anything, your life begins the moment we know your mom is pregnant, right?
Again, are we talking ritually or are we talking literally here?
From the standpoint of the permissibility, I mean, we're approaching this from the standpoint of permissibility or forbiddenness of abortion, specifically, and medical intervention. So we're considering the personness or lack thereof of the unborn child. So because your life as a person, I should probably be more precise. There's no hint of personhood in any way.
Because the context of what they were concerned about,
Right.
as far as keeping the law and not keeping the law,
Right.
it could be construed that the reason they were coming up with that differentiation was prior to knowing what we know.
Right.
But then David knew, right? So they would have to differentiate between that, because just to define
Right.
when they could or could not partake and what was owed and things like that.
Right.
So they might be making a differentiation
Um,
there for that purpose,
yeah.
which might be different than actually saying that it is or it isn't. For the sake of the mother, as opposed
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking
Another-
just about ritual purity or impurity here. Like, if that's what you mean, kind of religiously or spiritually pregnant, we're definitely not talking just about that. We're talking about really, really pregnant, because that's what, defines the marriage as having been fully consummated. If she's pregnant by her now deceased husband, they really were married, and she really is pregnant.
That's like saying, and I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want to belabor the point, but
Yeah.
the love your neighbor as yourself. A lot of people go there and they say, well, that means you're supposed to love yourself.
Sure.
I'm not sure that
Sure.
it really means that.
Mhm.
I mean, love your neighbor, be concerned about your neighbor
Sure.
as you would be concerned about yourself.
Okay.
But loving yourself, I mean,
Sure.
God's loving us, we're receiving that
Sure.
love, and then we're giving it back to him, and then he's basically
Sure.
loving through us
Okay.
to a certain extent. So it doesn't really mean that we're supposed to love ourselves as much as it's just defining or trying to say, hey, if you're that concerned about yourself,
Mhm.
then hey, be concerned about your neighbor at least that much.
Sure.
But then,
Okay.
but then actual love, we're talking about something else.
Right. So
I'm just, and I don't need you to explain.
Okay.
It's okay. I'm just saying.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. We can pursue it more later if you want. I mean, so what's important for us here is the legal consequentialness of that unborn child. And here it's essentially nil up until 40 days, at least with regard
not
to.
exactly saying God thinks that way. That he's saying that.
No.
That this is a child and this is not a child. We're not saying that that's the case, right?
God's opinion is not relevant to this discussion.
Okay.
No, I think even to ask the rabbis too, that's precisely what they would say. There's a whole other, there's a great discussion for another day where the rabbis are debating.
I just want to make sure you weren't saying that.
Well, from the rabbinic standpoint, it's in human hands to decide the law. They're interpreting scripture and through tradition, but trying to divine what God thinks or doesn't think is not the premise of the discussion.
Okay.
For them, it's up to their reason. Lo b'shamayim is the quote that they like to go to. It's not in heaven; it's here on earth for us to decide what the law is, and for our purposes, where we're making the decision: does this woman get to eat truma or not? These are the rules that the rabbis come up with to determine that, and consequent to that.
But is there a conferring in that? I mean,
Can we move on?
Yeah. We're building up a picture of the legal status of the unborn child here. We've looked at a couple other sources where the unborn child appears to be treated like property and things like that. So we're building up this picture about how the rabbis understand it. So, like I said, if anything, the significance of a life begins from a halakhic perspective after 40 days. Up to that point, as it says, fetus is merely water, driven by practical concerns, as we said. And today most abortions are performed within the first trimester before a woman begins showing, and we now have a rabbinic premise, if not an outright warrant, because this is not a text about abortion. We learn about the status of a fetus, which can help inform our discussion of abortion, but it's not a text about abortion. So it probably not an outright warrant for first trimester abortion, but it's at least
40 days is far short of the first.
Yes, right. That's what I'm saying. So it's at least a premise on which one could, it's a building block.
Okay.
Is that, yes, good word. Yes. Okay. I would say it also, and this is incidental, it probably also constitutes a premise to permit birth control methods, like things like the morning after pill and stuff like that. That's definitely, undoing the results of the consummated marriage within that 40 days, but that's another discussion. Okay. So let's return to, we've sort of looked at the tail end of the window. where the baby's in the process of being born. We've looked at the very beginning again. Let's return to that later end when abortion could potentially be considered. A partially born child, we said, as soon as the greater half of the head is out, for sure abortion's off the table. That is a fully fledged nefesh. However, a partially born child could still very well represent a danger to the life of the mother. So let's read another text. We're on to Sanhedrin 72b. You're up in the reading order. Would you like to read, or do you want to pass? We're on source number 6.
Is that?
Okay, it's up to you. If you don't want to, it's okay. We can pass it.
And then I'd have to pronounce it the right way.
Ideally, we can correct it.
Rob has raised an objection to Rav Huna from a Baraita.
Baraita, yeah, it's another text, another tradition that they know. It's sort of from the director's cut. It was something they know, but didn't make the final cut. So it's a tradition that they know. Go ahead.
If a woman was giving birth and her life was being endangered by the fetus, the life of the fetus may be sacrificed in order to save the mother. But once his head has emerged during the birthing process, he may not be harmed in order to save the mother, because one life may not be pushed aside to save another life.
Okay, I'll pause you there for just a second. So that's just what we established earlier back in whichever, I think that was the Mishnah. Yes, good. Yeah, that was back in Mishnah Oholot, that if she's struggling to give birth, they can abort the fetus to save her. But if his head has already emerged, nothing we can do. Okay, onwards.
If one is permitted to save the pursued party by killing the minor who is pursuing him, why is this so? The fetus is a pursuer who is endangering his mother's life.
Okay, I got to pause you there again to bring up another point we set up right at the beginning. One of the other reasons you can kill somebody is if they are a rodef, if they are a pursuer. If they have the intention to kill someone else, you are not only permitted, but in fact obligated to stop them, including through the use of lethal force if necessary. Good. So if you're permitted to save the pursued party by killing the minor pursuing them, why would we not kill this baby who's about to kill its mother? The fetus is a rodef. The fetus is a pursuer endangering the mother's life. Okay. Let's resolve. It seems like the Mishnah, or this Breita, which is actually in the Mishnah elsewhere, is wrong. How does the Talmud resolve it? Take it away. Yeah.
The Gemara answers, "This is not difficult, as it is different there."
It's a different case, in other words. Yeah.
With regard to the woman giving birth, since she is being pursued by heaven, since the fetus is not acting of his own volition and endangering his mother of his own will, his life may not be taken in order to save his mother.
Okay, so we bring up the possibility maybe this partially born child is a rodef, and therefore we would be permitted to kill it in order to save the mother. But the Gemara dismisses that possibility because
No intent.
no, there's no intent. Good. There's no volition, and in fact, what it says is this is also relevant to. Sort of touches back on our discussion 4 weeks ago about autonomy versus heteronomy and decision making. The resolution of the tension between the need for human autonomy in order for the law to be valid and divine omnipotence. Like if we need to be able to choose in order to be bound by the law and to pay the price when we break it, but also God has ultimate power and God could just make us do what God wants. How do we resolve that? You may recall that line, all is foreseen, yet free will is granted. In other words, and the other line, everything is up to heaven except the fear of heaven. In other words, God makes the big picture, sort of large scale, seemingly random stuff in the world happen. We're responsible for what we control, for our individual decisions. So this is what it says. Basically, God has put the fetus there. The fetus didn't choose to be there.
Basically, it's saying that God is the root.
Yeah, it's being pursued by heaven, right? Right. This is a sort of this is a factor beyond anyone's control. So if it's beyond our control, it has to be under God's control, and that's just how it is. Therefore, there's nothing we can do. Okay. questions? Adam?
Well, I'm wondering, just technical
Yeah.
point, the
Yeah.
head is emerged, so theoretically, it can take a breath, and it's a breathing
Probably.
entity at that point. Was that kind of the idea there?
I am not, not enough of a comprehensive scholar, but that sounds entirely plausible based on what we've talked about. Understanding what makes us people is that breath of life, the neshama, right?
Yeah.
That makes a certain amount of sense.
That's the thought.
It certainly works, harmonizes that way. I don't know if that's explicitly part of why they chose that or not,
Yeah.
but that may certainly make sense.
I'm not a medical doctor. I'm wondering what's the time frame like once the head does come out? I mean, is there some urgency or can the birthing process keep taking like a really long time and the baby not have oxygen and then at some point takes the first breath? I mean, there must be some.
Don't know.
Period.
Not sure that's necessarily what they're thinking about here either.
No, I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
It's a side note, different.
Sure. So even though this seems like this doesn't get us where we want to go, the possibility is dismissed here. It's an important example to bring because, looking at this from the personhood, both of the fetus and the mother, mom is a person, clearly deserving of the moral consideration granted the protection from a rodef, something that a person deserves, according to our previous reasoning, is other people have to prevent you from being murdered, basically. And so we at least need to consider that here. Two, the partially born child is also a person in this case and deserving of moral consideration of its volition in terms of becoming a rodef. Just like we wouldn't punish somebody who, didn't shoot, killed accidentally. We wouldn't punish with, first degree murder someone who killed accidentally, or with outside their own volition. We don't punish this child because it didn't choose its fate, right? And it helped us tremendously now in terms of knowing where to draw the line, right? We're trying to balance these personhoods and figure out what we owe to each of them. And this is a useful text from that standpoint in terms of helping us draw that line. Okay. We're coming up on having taken enough time here, so I'm going to go a little quickly through a few remaining bits and pieces. We are not going to achieve a full treatment of this issue. I hope you're not too disappointed. Okay, results so far. Terminating an unborn child when the mother's life is at risk, as we said, is in fact obligatory up to that crucial point. Remember back in Mishnah Ohla, there's no may. It's not that you may go ahead and do what you need to do. They just do. Some important, caveats that are relevant to the debate as it takes shape in American discourse. Things like, what if there's doubt about whether her life is at risk or not? How do you even know that? What if the risk to the mother is not necessarily fatal risk, but risk of injury or risk of, excessive suffering or emotional distress? What do we do in those kind of cases? A few words on those. We're uncertain whether or not the rodef will succeed in murdering, right? We still stop them by lethal force if necessary. Basically, we don't know if the blow is going to be lethal. We just see their hand raised, poised to strike, right? And that's enough of a warrant for us to stop them with lethal force as necessary. So, maybe they would just inflict a wound. Maybe they'd miss with their stab, or maybe they would, inflict a non-fatal wound. Nonetheless, we're allowed to use, lethal force if necessary. So the threshold for what counts as endangering her life can be understood to be relatively low, since we don't know. There's at least enough wiggle room there. And as we'll see, rabbis rule in a lot of different ways about this. The threshold is potentially quite low for what could count as endangering a mother's life. It also allows plenty of room for precaution. If a particularly cautious doctor or rabbi or combination thereof could potentially say anything that's counts as hard birth, could open up the possibilities for us.
And I was going to say that within this is shifting the frame a little bit, but within police work, I mean, it's recently there's a pretty broad category of using lethal force without consequence, and we've seen this.
Right.
And this is kind of what you're talking about.
Right.
It's a broad range of interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That it can be used.
Yeah. Good. So also, the rabbis understood that harm that a person can do to another person is, people could harm each other not just physically, not just materially. There's other ways I can hurt you besides hurting your body or your stuff. People can hurt each other non-materially as well. And they assess damages for things like pain and shame. Adam, you're up to read. Do you mind reading number 7 real quick?
1. He who wounds his fellow is liable to compensate him on 5 counts: for injury, for pain, for healing, for loss of income, and for indignity. For injury, how so? If he blinded his fellow's eye, cut off his hand, or broke his foot, his fellow is looked upon as if he was a slave to be sold in the market, and they assess how much he was worth and how much
He is worth.
how much he is worth, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was worth it.
Right.
For pain, if he burned him with a spit or nail, even though it was on his fingernail, a place where it leaves no wound, they estimate how much money such a man would be willing to take to suffer so.
Okay, and it goes on to tell how do we figure out the cost for healing, the payment for loss of income, payment for loss of dignity, right? But the important ones are there. So permitting abortion in a non-life-threatening situation is within the realm of possibility. Remember, the unborn fetus, is in some cases treated as property if it's damaged. Therefore, it could, if property means your stuff, in other words, your money, could potentially be balanced against non-material injury to another person. That makes sense? Like, if I was to cause you pain, I might pay you money. That, if fetus is sort of like property and stuff, that could potentially balance on the scale that way. And I brought this text to show that from the rabbi's perspective, pain is real in terms of, pain and suffering are real from the standpoint of requiring compensation when they're caused, right? And they have some clever ways of calculating it. They add up what you would have been worth on the slave market and what you're worth now. That's some reality for you, right? Or how much would you let someone pay you to endure a hot poker on your fingernail? That's how much the pain is, So okay, these are clever, but it's getting at the idea, which is a pretty common. You're a lawyer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I get it. Okay, a pretty fundamental premise that there are damages for suffering and so. Moreover, there's no evidence anywhere that the fetus is considered in any way separate from the mother's body. Let's check out Arachin 7a, just another Gemara text. You mind reading? Go ahead.
I need to.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Anna.
Yeah,
Take care.
Enjoy.
I already kept you too long.
I know.
Good. Go ahead, Rachel.
What show is it?
The Bachelor finale.
Not for Adam's sake. For his.
Yeah.
That's the learning topic at Baby Drush next week is Shalom Beit, peace in the home. So you are being a good example of creating. Go ahead. Take care. Go ahead, Rachel.
In the case of a pregnant woman who is taken by the court to be executed, the court does not wait to execute her until she gives birth. Rather, she is killed immediately. But with regard to a woman taken to be executed who sat on the travailing chair in the throes of labor, the court waits to execute her until she gives birth.
Okay, so note here that's the Mishnah, and this is the Gemara. Then the later coming to comment on that. They just both happen to be next to each other here. So you said wow again, or something to that effect. That's not necessarily what we would expect. A pregnant woman who's due to be executed, they don't wait. They just go ahead and kill her, at least according to the Mishnah. But if she's got as far as the travailing chair, in other words, or the birthing stool, as I think the Bible calls it, in other words, the chair where you do all the work, and into the throes of labor, they wait until she gives birth. Okay, why? And the Gemara's immediate question is like, why do we need this information? Go ahead.
Isn't it obvious that the court executes the pregnant woman rather than waiting? After all, it is part of her body.
So that's the key point here. Like, if the baby, evidently, and they think it's obvious that like this isn't its own. It's not its own separate person yet at all. It's part of her, and therefore there's nothing lost. Go ahead.
The Gemara answers, it was necessary for the Mishnah to teach this, as it might enter your mind to say that since it is written, And if men strive together and hurt a woman with child, so that her offspring depart, he shall be fined, as the woman's husband shall place upon him.
Familiar text, yeah.
The fetus is considered to be the property of the husband.
Mhm.
If so, the court should wait until she gives birth before executing her, and not cause him to lose the fetus.
That would be him losing out, right, on his property, okay?
Consequently, the Mishnah teaches us that the court does not take this factor into account.
That poor husband whose wife is due to be executed, he just loses out in this
My
case.
wife was executed and I didn't even get a baby.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that is how the halacha ends up sometimes. It's like somebody sometimes has to lose out, and here it's the husband, evidently. I mean, he's not the only one probably losing out. Yes, I'm being extremely crass about this. Okay. Good. So if the this is if abortion even for if the fetus is considered part of the woman's body, then potentially abortion even for non-life threatening situations is on the same level as medical treatment for the woman, just as she has the agency to say something like, perform this operation to make my foot stop hurting. She could potentially say, perform this abortion to make me stop suffering, to make me stop hurting, right? Potentially, that's within the realm of possibility, according to their understanding from this source. Okay, this is not to say that abortion can be performed for no reason, and I'm gonna touch just very quickly on some more. This would usually be Rabbi Jonathan's domain. I feel like to bring the more modern, contemporary texts, but that's not to say abortion for no reason. Going back to the Bible, things like spilling seed, as it were, is a serious transgression, and that's just sperm wasted, not even an embryo wasted. Like even sperm that has no chance to fertilize an egg. Biblical story: God kills Onan for failing to. He's supposed to marry his deceased brother. He's supposed to sleep with his widowed wife for levirate marriage. He doesn't. He spills the seed instead, so God kills him. It's the origin of the term for masturbation in Hebrew, onanut. There you go. Share that with your Hebrew students. Please don't. But as we said up front, we have to take our moral intuitions into account. And the rabbis did this too, recognizing the holiness, the sanctity of potential life. So even given all of this, even given, sources that, tell us that the fetus could potentially be considered property, part of the woman, nothing but water at various stages along the way, that doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want. Like, this is all balanced with that sense that this is still a potential person. So contemporary responsa, in other words, rabbinic opinions in response to questions about, can we perform abortion or not? They take the stage of pregnancy into account a lot. They assign terms like potential life for before 40 days, developing life from between 40 days and 6 months. In other words, to the end of the second trimester, which is, I believe, the latest that abortion's permitted in any state. After 6 months, the fetus, they also bring up, well, we don't know if this is going to be a viable fetus or not. We're not certain, so terminating in basically the third trimester would be possible murder, doubtful murder, something like that. Like, we're not certain it's murder because it may have never been viable in the first place. That would mean, but it's certainly a possibility. Interestingly, it's not certain murder until 30 days post-birth. This is a whole other interesting discussion, is that, basically we still don't count a born child as a full-fledged person for all sorts of purposes until they're at least a month old. For example, were they to die in those first 30 days, you wouldn't be an obligated mourner for them. You wouldn't have to recite Kaddish, things of that nature, which I think is another bit of realia. There were a lot of babies that died in the first 30 days. There would be a lot of obligated mourners and a lot of additional pain. So it's sort of like, I think it's an intentional distancing in some ways, but that's a whole other discussion. There's a lot of debate among halakhic decisors about the exact criteria for committing abortion. As you might expect, a lot of the more orthodox opinions are more conservative, restricting the opportunities when abortion is permitted or not. Although I would say in general, they're all, it's not just straight up forbidden in all cases, but they all take all of these examples into account. The mission that says you have to save the mother's life is taken into account. Basically, every Orthodox rabbi will say, if we're sure if we're sure her life is in danger, you have to do it. There's no like blanket prohibition anywhere. One notable ultra-Orthodox opinion that I think is worth taking note of is number 9 there, the Tzitz Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg was he passed away in 2006. He was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi in Jerusalem. And I thought this was worth bringing because he's on the permissive end, I would say, in terms of opinions even among the ultra-Orthodox. He is right here says if there's a danger to the mother from continuing the pregnancy, one should permit abortion without hesitation. Also, if her health is poor and to cure her or to relieve her from great pain, it's necessary to abort the fetus, even if she's not in actual danger, there's room to permit it based on the halachic authority's evaluation of the situation. So already fairly broad. There's another opinion I cut for space. In the event they find out the fetus has Tay-Sachs disease, a Jewish genetic disease, the Tzitz Eliezer would permit termination of that pregnancy as well. Not every rabbi agrees with that. He's one of the opinions that does support that. I just wanted to bring, Rachel.
Do we know if he's specifying physical pain only or mental pain as well?
I have not read his entire halachic treatise. It is extremely long. I pulled the part that someone else pointed me to, so I don't know. And by way of concluding, I would say we live in an era now where you should not end your examination of this topic by listening to what this male rabbi has to say on this issue. Listen to what women have to say, particularly women who are rabbis. One of my favorites is Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. She's a conservative movement rabbi. She's on Twitter, if you're on Twitter. It's a fabulous Twitter follow. She's written a book called Passionate Torah. It's all about sex and Judaism. It's really good. A note from her that I thought was worth bringing too, that kind of compares Jewish attitudes to prevailing Christian attitudes. And this is a direct quote from Rabbi Ruttenberg. Interestingly, many Christian communities derive their proof texts against permitting abortion from the Hebrew Bible, same as we do, like verses about God forming humans in the womb, things like Psalms 139, Jeremiah, Isaiah, texts which don't even register in the Jewish legal conversation on this topic. So that, as she says, to put it simply, we don't derive matters of Jewish law from Psalms. So interestingly, that's one of the, if you're kind of wondering why do we go one direction despite sharing a text in common, they have a very different process where they take texts that to us are prophetic texts, poetic texts, liturgy, and explicitly not for the purpose of deriving halakha, and we preference and prioritize Torah texts and rabbinic interpretation of those Torah texts above those other parts of the Hebrew Bible, which I think is a useful note. Last thing I'll say before closing, one direction the halakhic discussion doesn't go that you might have thought it would, trying to figure out when the fetus gets its soul. So we touched on that a little bit, the switch from chai to nefesh, right?
Yeah.
And something we talked about at the beginning, and that's why I brought back Nida 31a there, which was a text for us a long time ago, where they just taught there's 3 partners in the creation of a person. Basically, the mother and the father combine to make the body part, the physical stuff, and the Holy One of blessing inserts into him a spirit, a soul, giving him his countenance, eyesight, hearing in the ear, capability of speech, the mouth, the capability of walking with legs, understanding and wisdom. In other words, the part that makes us more than just an animal is, the divine part. You would think that might be a crucial element of discussion. Like, when does that giving of the spirit, soul, whatever, happen? There are texts that speculate on this, but they also don't become the focal point for halakhic discussion. There's no way to know exactly why that is. I like to think it's because there's probably some awareness that that's not a really knowable answer. There's all we have are, post-biblical traditions about that. And in that way, it's subject to a lot of arbitrary, sort of sort of thoughts. I think the Zohar goes into this. I'm sure we could find some mystical text about, exactly what point a potential human gets their soul. There's definitely a tradition about how unborn children know all of the secrets of the Torah, and then as soon as they're out, they forget it all, right? So this is the kind of thing that the Kabbalah goes into, the mystical tradition goes into, that the Halachic tradition very much does not. Okay. Thank you so much for learning with me. If you were interested in further reading on ideas about personhood, I would really recommend this book. This is called Human Nature and Jewish Thought. I'll hold it up on the screen, by Alan Middleman. You can check it out if you like. Judaism's Case for Why Persons Matter. It's like basically a lot of what we were talking about. It's a short and excellent read. Came out, I think, it came out while I was in rabbinical school. I remember my teacher saying, I'm really excited, 2015, saying, I'm really excited to read this book. Human Nature and Jewish Thought. Here, I'll send it down. You can check it out. Like I said, I think this is really powerful Torah, thinking in terms of personhood for all sorts of decision-making that's grounded in Jewish values. It takes into account what we care about most, creation, the divine image, essential dignity, afforded to God's creatures. So there's a lot more we could do. If there ever ends up being a second part of this class, I hope you'll help me brainstorm some ideas for where topics that would be interesting to examine from a perspective of comparing the personhoods involved. And thank you very much. Thanks to everyone watching. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. I'll shut this down.
You just open the door a little bit.
Yeah.